We have Joanne Cooper. Jo is the founder and managing director of IDExchange, and she's a second-generation IT entrepreneur. So her dad was a famous guy called Tom Cooper. You can ask her about him later, but Jo has over 30 years of experience in this space. She's a passionate advocate for protecting our digital freedoms, and she does this using a thing called advanced consent tools and secure platforms that basically shift the playing field with the premise that people, every one of us, should be able to control what happens to our personal information. So that's Jo. We've got Day Williams. Day, hello. Day is the Chief Growth Officer at SiteMinder. And if you don't know what SiteMinder is, it's the global hotel industry's leading guest acquisition program. He's responsible for the growth and diversification of what is really a disruptive SaaS model and something that's made SiteMinder a tech pioneer. Now, Day oversees the company's entry into new markets, and he has held some very key roles that have turned the company into a bit of a powerhouse from its earliest days. I asked him how long he'd been around. He said he thought about 10 years. So that's Day. We've got Sylvain Mansotte. Hi, Sylvain is with us here kind of via France, via Boston. So Sylvain is a whistleblower. He blew the whistle on a $21 million fraud. And he's the co-founder and CEO of Whispli, which is also a B2B SaaS platform which makes whistleblowing and anonymous trusted conversations safe and easy. Sylvain he describes himself as a Frozzy, which, in case you're wondering, is a French-Australian. And he's worked in Europe, APAC, and North America. Now, these days, Sylvain and his family are in Boston, but he spends a lot of his time flying around the globe. And last but definitely not least is Wang. And Mac is with us today from Stripe. He's Stripe's head of Australia and New Zealand. Now, Mac works with many of Australia's best and most cutting-edge startups and enterprises, and these include people like Xero, Airtasker, Catch Group, Culture Amp, Venomofo, Seek, and Canva. And what Mac does is he helps them securely accept payments and expand rapidly into global markets, and basically helps them to catalyze growth. Now, Mac's expertise is in technology infrastructure and really using that infrastructure to power successful online businesses. It's a pretty stellar crew that we have here today. So, guys, I really wanted to start with why, and the why for going global. So maybe I'll start with you, Sylvain. What was the driver for taking Whispli global? Was it organic or was it international? Was it intentional?
So we started in Australia 4 years ago, but the need for going global came from the nature of our business, where individuals using the platform are actually employees from companies, and those employees can be anywhere on earth. And so that's how it all started. We started to have the need to translate or to make the platform available in different languages. And because I'm a Frozzy, luckily I can speak 2 languages, and I know the European culture. And for me, it was kind of also easy to grow that business, which today is about 40% of Whispli revenue, even though we only opened an office in Paris very recently. So we had nobody on the ground and managed to grow the business there as well.
I might just throw that to the others on the panel. Does anybody else want to comment on, the why? Was this just something that you woke up one day and thought, we've got to go global, or did you set out from day one and say, hey, we are out there to conquer every territory on earth?
Yeah, I'll have a quick SiteMinder view on it. I think when you start out, similar to the presentation we just saw before, there's a period there where you kind of incubate, you've got a gut feel, and you kind of hope for the best. You go through a couple of iterations, and something starts to stick. And I think it's at that point you think, like, what does growth look like for me as a business, and what aspirations do the founders have? I think in our context, it was we wanted to be a high growth SaaS company. Yeah. The market we operate in is hotels, and the vast majority of hotel supply in the world sits in Western Europe, particularly in the kind of B&B and boutique property type business. So for us, if we wanted to grow at all beyond a kind of 2 to 3 year window, we had to expand. So it was a necessity for us.
All right. Jo, is it the same for you?
Well, thanks, Cynthia, and good afternoon, everyone. I suppose we identified a glitch in the market, And privacy is a human right. So we realised that data was not something that could omit your right to be able to control your personal information. So it wasn't that we could just say, well, it will be privacy for Australia. It was a global condition, and therefore we had to consider that, people's also, you travel, so you may be in one country today, but you may land in a country tomorrow. How did that regulation work? So we really saw it as something that we had to tackle in different theatres of the world, but it was a global scenario.
Yeah.
For us, I think we were really interested in this question as well when we thought of our users and people that work with Stripe are often going global. And so we did a bit of a study a year or so ago around what we kind of called global natives, because people were doing it so early. And we found there was a real opportunity cost of actually not going quite quickly, in the sense that when we studied companies, the ones that went in their first year were growing 140 points faster in later years than companies that went global later.
Yep. And I think that's a really interesting point, because that kind of goes against the traditional wisdom that we often hear, which is, no, you have to consolidate your home market first. Maybe you should wait till it's completely saturated, and then you should look around for growth opportunities elsewhere. Do people have a view on whether that's different industry by industry?
Probably add something there. So for us, when we started building privacy enhancing technology in 2015, Australia didn't have an appetite for it. Corporates have their heads deeply in the sandpit of denial that there was issues with their data. So we actually had to look to global regulation, and it was clear for us that the European Union were putting out what we call now the global benchmark of regulation. So it meant that we had to go into that market and test our theories and catalysts for what we were doing to get that early entry.
Yeah.
I think for us, Australia is a great country. You can try many things, and there's still things that we're trying in Australia, but it's limited in its size. And however, I didn't start Whispli because of legislation or regulation, but it just happened that the world has evolved in 4 years. And Australia has passed a legislation on whistleblowing earlier this year, and this is kind of also fueling the need for our product. The same thing is happening has happened in France and is happening throughout Europe. So we just follow kind of those legislations, which is kind of handy, but never started the business with thinking that we would surf the wave of regulation and legislation.
Yeah, I'd say we followed quite a similar path. It's probably easier for us to go global with a certain sector of the travel market than it is to get really deep in countries. So we have a very practical example. Our software works well in kind of complex travel environments. So you're in a city like New York or San Francisco or London or Sydney, it's great. You're in Burke, New South Wales, the value prop's a bit harder to get. So it's expanding. It allowed us to actually go deeper in complex travel environments where our value prop's better than getting really deep in Australia where the value prop starts to get a bit harder.
Makes a lot of sense.
I was just going to say, I think we see the trend in both B2B, B2C type businesses. So probably different drivers in the sense that you see a lot of B2C businesses leveraging Brand Australia to a certain extent, going internationally. So whether that's someone like Supernova that has a bunch of cosmetic type products, so you get safety and security. But B2B side, I think you also see a lot of especially venture-backed startups almost more dominated in the B2B side now. And then of course the markets are just bigger and have higher potential.
Yeah. And I think maybe a reason for this trend that we're seeing of companies being able to go global earlier and do well is that people can now sell internationally in ways that they couldn't 10 or even 5 years ago. So maybe that's got something to do with it.
Yep. Absolutely, yeah.
Mac, I've got another question for you around the how of going global. Building for global scale is something that, well, not every founder, but a lot of founders care about, especially in this region. But it's really often quite hard to know when that needs to happen. What kind of things do you think companies need to take into consideration?
Yeah, the things that we often hear about and talk about are actually infrastructural kind of choices. So I think there's a lot of elements that we could talk about, whether it's go-to-market or product itself, product market fit, which we heard from Rebecca before. But I think when we often think about it is there's infrastructural and tooling choices that can help. And almost making those choices early is going to save time later. And the pinch point that we find on that is almost the developer side of things. So I think we probably all know that it's not the easiest thing to find engineers and developers, especially in Australia. I think in that same survey, I think Australia was almost the hardest sort of to get developer talent.
Yeah.
And so what we try to think about is almost can we help from if choosing a tool that is going to be something that you can leverage in new markets when you go, or can help you test from here. And so that's where I guess our kind of payments and economic infrastructure angle, we try to make that seamless.
Yeah.
And so that's one angle. I'm sure there's plenty of others on the how that some of the founders and early stage people might have comments.
something we need to take into account is the cost of actually going global. For a long time, actually, because I only relocated to Boston in July last year, we ran Whispli from Sydney, and that was a lot more cost effective, because as soon as you move overseas, you've got all those the cost that fall onto you. And I guess for Whispli, just opening the Boston office was probably $100K, which is a lot of money for an early stage startup. So that's definitely a consideration. And once you're in country, it's usually a different go-to-market approach as well. So you have to learn a lot of things, and you might waste a lot of time to actually learn all of that. So it's about making sure that you're surrounded by the right people that understand the market you go into. But I think there's a lot of things we can do from Australia in terms of going global without necessarily having to be located in that country, at least in the early days.
Let's have a bit of a chat about that, because hearing you say that is again really interesting, because that kind of goes against another bit of this traditional wisdom, which is, I sat on a panel with somebody recently, with a CEO of a listed company, and he said, you get to a point with an international expansion where you just have to have feet on the ground. You just can't manage everything from Sydney. You can't see what's going on and understand the dynamic in another part of the world from here. What do you guys on the panel say to that? Would you agree? Would you disagree? Why?
Yeah, I would say, so SiteMinder, we've almost made a business out of saying that that's not true, having you need to have feet on the ground. So we run it does depend your industry and the economics of your deals and stuff. We run we've got about 150 sales reps around the world in 3 or 4 core offices, selling in 10 or 11 different languages. And when we started expanding to Europe, and it's kind of any country around the world, you'll hear the same anecdote, which is you don't understand insert country, and it's honestly, any country is a face-to-face market. Yeah. Honestly, any country you go to in the world, someone will tell you it's face-to-face. And we found that with a really good value prop, some really strong sales and funnel hygiene, you can actually do it remotely. So we've got, in Spain's a real example, we've got 15 Spanish-speaking sales reps in London, and we are 5-6 times bigger than the next biggest company in Spain. Yep. All from London. So there are deals, there are times where you do need local influence, that kind of stuff, sure, don't disagree, but the economics of the super high-paid biz dev person on the ground don't really stack up for a lot of SaaS companies anymore.
There's something really basic, which is around demos. For instance, there's Diane is here in the room, and she works for Whispli, and she sometimes does demo at 10 or 11 p.m. at night. Not great when you've got customers in Europe. So they're the thing that you do, kind of willingly in the early days, but you can't just sustain that for years. So the other things you need to consider as well is how practical is it to have your team located in Australia if your customers are based in London. So sometimes you have to kind of spread your resources, but definitely in the early days you can do with being only located in Australia. And I have to say that Australians and Australian startups have a really good reputation pretty much wherever I go. And certainly in the US, they kind of like the Australian startups, I guess. It's a bit of a novelty from what they used to in the US. So don't feel that because you're in Australia, you're going to be really, really tiny. There's an appetite from whether it's investors or customers to actually deal with Australian startups. So just make sure they can surf that wave.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think it's consistent on both those themes, is actually knowing your business really well is actually the biggest driver in some ways about where you have to put people, because I think one of the things I find is there's probably at least 3 kind of buckets, especially when you think B2B around. There is actually a self-serve B2B world out there, and someone like Atlassian's probably a good example of that, where you can do growth marketing and you can drive that pretty centrally. I mean, sure, you absolutely have to understand your customers, but are you selling on the ground for that sort of product? Not necessarily. And so in there you have a lot of opportunity to kind of test almost. So for us, we see people testing currencies. You get traction, then okay, maybe you want to do something more local. And I think yours is a great example where you can do a lot more regionally than you sort of realize often. Yeah. And then, yeah, sure, there's going to be straight up enterprise sales where you need boots on the ground because you're going to sell into Fortune 500 companies, which is maybe a bit of a different equation.
Yeah. So we've been talking about where we might put team, but I mean, looking at the other side of the equation, I mean, Jo, how did you choose where you were going to expand to? And do you think there's a right way of doing this?
Well, there was an obvious choice for us. We followed the regulation, and that meant the UK. I'm lucky that I was born in the UK, so I've got dual citizenship, which means, because there's a lot of cost to setting up in another country. So we actually did something quite strategic. We applied to go on a trade delegation through the Australian-British Chamber of Commerce, and that's sponsored also by the UK Department of International Trade. And I have to say, it was one of the smartest strategic decisions we made. We got top grade advice on the things that we needed to do to curb our cost in entering a new country. We also got showcased in the top of town, all the thought leaders, the major banks, the regulators, introductions were put on show for us. And that opportunity actually gave us a time to, again, check as a catalyst, were we on the right path? And also meet 4 of the world leaders that all happened to be based in Europe. So as a result of that, we ended up getting offers from 4 companies to partner. We also, one of those partners had already invested, at that time, $70 million building military-grade infrastructure that we needed to build. So for us, it became very fast a decision, rather than moving, to collaborating. So we were in a position then that we had a company that wanted to be a partner. The founder had built US military systems, so he had a stellar reputation and a traction path to actually make our IP go global faster. So as a result of that, we didn't go global, we stayed in our home country, and we've become the bottom end of a global cluster, which has worked out much better for us.
Okay, that's interesting. Other thoughts on this question of how do you choose where to go to? I mean, Day, you've spoken about the fact that you've got an advantage and you've got high volumes in Europe and then some parts of Southeast Asia where there's a lot of choice in the hotel industry. Other factors?
Yeah, I think, digital businesses, I mean, we do a lot of inside sales because we have to drive a lot of demand. It's generally not a very digitally savvy buyer, but you follow you look for demand and people who search for the type of products you have as a kind of very early indicator. Because if you're going to go into these other countries, if people are just not searching for your service, like that's really hard, because then you not only have to do brand recognition, you actually have to do category education, and category education is a really, really hard thing to do before brand recognition. Probably the next big jump, you see a lot of companies who will expand within the kind of Anglophile world. So Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, US islands, a very, very common track for all of the countries to expand into. A materially challenging jump we made was when we moved to non-English languages, and I'm talking from a marketing, from a content, from an application level, from invoicing, from support. And we only did that once we started getting really, really deep into countries. So you'll flush out, when you go into non-English countries, you'll flush out the early buying part of the market who just wants the best product. It's when you start getting deeper than that and you have to be local, that there's a materially complex change that comes with your business. So like our actual application now is used by about 35,000 hotels around the world in 9 different languages. English, Spanish, French, Thai, Bahasa. It's genuinely complex, and the tax you pay on that is your ability to develop products slows down, because you're not just you can't just release stuff. Stuff has to be translated. The translation has to be QA'd. You find all this weird stuff, like you translate it into German. Some of the German phrases are too long for the application, and they kind of the words. So all that kind of stuff happens, but you only really want to do that if you're really going to knuckle down in a country and go, like, we're going all in on X country. You then start getting to that level.
So what do you do? I mean, how do we negotiate this trade-off between the opportunity and the feasibility? Because you could go for a tiny market with the same language, which is easy but doesn't deliver you that much upside, or you could go for a behemoth with a totally different language and culture, which could make you a lot of money or could completely tank the company.
Yeah, I think it's about being thoughtful about the goals that you want to achieve over a period of time. So we've tried to be quite disciplined and always having a 2 to 3 year lens of where the company needs to be from a growth perspective. And that kind of that dictates where you need to go. So we're going through a big expansion at the moment. You know, we've just tipped a fairly significant revenue milestone of 100 mil, and we want to triple. We want to 2.5 times the business and continue to grow at 30%. We just geographically have to expand. We don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But for a long time, we could get away without doing it. So it's about making known decisions rather than kind of following the bouncing ball, and like you can chase lots of rabbits in these fields for startup companies.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something to keep in mind is when you start, usually you have like an MVP and you try to figure out what you're actually selling, what's your value proposition, and this thing will evolve. And so if you go global immediately, just do it with like English-speaking country because that's going to be easier. Because as things evolve, you may have to actually rebuild. We rebuilt Whispli, last year, and it's kind of a painful process because it slows you down. But at least if you've targeted English-speaking countries, then you'll save time afterwards to like do those things around translations and QAs and all that. Because this is really, yes, it costs money and it's time-consuming and it's frustrating. Even though I speak 2 languages, for us to translate stuff in French, we tried to do it ourselves for the website. It was a freaking headache, and so we got professional translators to do that for us. And we know it's not perfect, but again, it takes time and costs money. So do it. I'd say the later the better. When you know you've got the right product, and you can expand from there.
I was just going to jump on what you were talking about there because I think we're like hinting at something around like culture. And I think at least from our perspective, like we also find like money is inherently like local. And so people like all the Anglo-Saxon countries tend to be pretty heavy cards markets, or at least bank markets. And then all of a sudden you go even just to Europe and you've got like Ideal and SEPA and GiroPay and all sorts of things. And of course, that's not even talking about kind of Asia where China's like leapfrogged everyone and brought out like, the volumes, the trillions that go through WeChat and Alipay. And so that's another, almost back to my original point that like thinking on that, those things will come up as well as like translation and sales, execution and localization. And so where are there kind of helpful ways to try and embark on those sort of things?
Yeah, yeah. We were talking just a moment ago about, Joe, you were mentioning that you basically followed the regulation and that was how you basically got into the UK and then launched from there. What other kinds of regulatory issues did you encounter? I mean, you followed regulation to actually get where you were going, but what regulatory issues did you encounter as you were starting to grow across borders?
Where do I start on that one? Just let's bring that back to home. We've got a new thing here called the Consumer Data Right, which is not quite passed through Parliament yet. Now, that regulation is a bounce off of UK regulation on the open banking regime, PSD2. The GDPR PDR has a data portability component of that. Australia can consult that. So we have to not only look at the local regulation, we have to understand how cross-border will work, what the vulnerabilities in the network are. So it opens a plethora of things. And it's also made it very poignant to us that we have to become quasi-lobbyists. Yeah. We actually have to try and help government set policy that will work with technology, and not just technology that's traditional and today, new emerging platforms that they don't even understand. So, we do a lot of consulting. That we're not a consulting firm, we're a technology firm, but that's become a byproduct of what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, regulation is like, what a time to be alive. It's like counterintuitive that it's got like harder. Well, I don't know if it's now counterintuitive, but over the last few years, the fact it's almost got harder to sort of build a global business is what we found in the same sort of survey that we found. And I don't know, I half want to ask Di because we were chatting about this before, but like we see the same thing with like PSD2, but like SCA is another like very paymenty thing with strong customer authentication, where Europe's taken the lead again as being quite clear about what they're going to do, and that's kind of impacting businesses literally in the next few months. And so we see that like trend actually increasing. And on your data point, then there's like India and a lot of markets in Southeast Asia talking about like data localization requirements as well, and all those things kind of drive complexity and efforts.
Yeah, I think that there's the compliance stuff can have a really heavy tax on your product. I think it depends where your product sits in the supply chain, but our experience has been the kind of engine of our product is just connectivity tissue. Like we We connect systems to online booking sites. We do have a product that actually allows hotels, like very small hotels, actually run their business online. And that's got a very heavy compliance factor for us. So yeah, fun fact around how hotels operate in Europe. Every hotel in Europe has to keep a copy of every person staying at their hotel, a passport for a couple of days. And Australia just doesn't operate like that. Like an Aussie hotel would never have to, a Kiwi hotel, an English hotel, but the French hotels do. And this stuff becomes legislation. So it's just, if you don't like tick that box, you actually just can't sell your product there. So that gets quite challenging.
Yeah.
I think the message from me is like we're a compliance platform, so it maybe does help our business. But the way we've built Whispli is it's like a pile of Lego bricks, and you make it your own Lego, and so people will configure it in a way that's suit their requirements for the different legislations or regulations that they need to comply with. When it becomes interesting is when you got two different countries that conflict. If you take France and China, for instance, it's kind of hard for some of our clients to make it work because no matter what they're going to do, they're not going to comply. But at least the platform allows them to configure it in the way they like it to be configured, and that's something you need to keep in mind because if you just have a one size system, you will face problems as you grow overseas because all of those clients will have different views on things, or they will be subject to different regulations or legislation. So you need to make it kind of flexible.
Those are some great points. Now, each of you guys has a global team to some extent. You've got staff spread out around the world. How do you make sure that you can create a high-performing team when you've got people split across time zones and different amounts of connectivity and different languages? How do you hold that all together and make it cohesive? Tips and tricks.
I guess you learn as you go, but for me it's the first time. So and we've got people in Paris, London, Boston, and Sydney, and I think there's definitely something that connects us. It's an email a week that everybody gets from me to just get a bit of an update on how we're tracking. We try to with my people. I'm usually on Slack every day with the people around the world. We try to bring people to Australia as well. So we'll take people from Australia to other countries. But it's about growing that culture, making sure that they've got that sense of belonging to Whispli and that they're all part of a team. And it's harder when you've got most of your team in Australia and smaller teams in other part of the world. But it's all about communication, I guess.
Yeah, I think probably the hardest jumps we've made on the way up are when you go from, as a leader, you just know what everyone does day to day, to when you start to get layered away from the front line. And then when you throw in the complexity of time zone, probably the thing that we did too late, that if we did it again, we'd do in hindsight, was a lot of times going global is exciting until it's not and it starts going wrong. And then what happens then is you rely, you generally rely on what the regions tell you is happening in the market. And when that happens, you'll get two answers every time without fail. One is a competitor's beating us, or two is your product's too expensive. It's always one of those two things. So we've made the shift too late, but we're much better at it now, which is when you have performance-orientated conversations with people that are not in the room with you, it has to be driven by data and not emotion. Yeah. Right? You have to be able to talk to them about the mechanics of the funnel or customer or CSAT or something like that. And then the anecdotes spill out of the conversation. The anecdotes are not the conversation, because if you let the anecdote lead, it gets really, really hard when stuff's not going well.
Yeah.
I would say that Zoom is my best friend. I speak to thought leaders around the world weekly, and we all talk from our home offices. I mean, I've been through the whole generation of mobile computing through my career, but it really is paying back to me in spades now. Those conversations could be triangulating across UK, Australia and the US, and we have to find time that works. So I think one of the things when you're in a global position and you're shifting global marketplaces, you don't get particular about the where and when, you just make it happen. And luckily today we have very effective tools that allow us to have those. And we find it very, very important that we have those visuals, because those visual cues, when you've got different cultures, different accents, they also help you read into someone's expression if they're not understanding or they're showing concern. So we find those tools very, very useful.
Yeah. Now, Day, you were saying a moment ago that going global is fun until it's not. And because, this global expansion piece is a massive roller coaster, can I just get each of you to share with me an oh no moment that you've had? Where suddenly you've gone, oh no, this is really not working out how we wanted it to.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll have many monthly. But I think the first time you probably start to miss your target and you don't know why.
Yeah.
Right? So you hit 70% of what you thought you'd do, a 50% upturn has been going well, and then all of a sudden the numbers don't come in and the growth's slowing down, and you're sitting in Australia scratching your head. That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
Because then you've just got no feel for the day-to-day, you've got no feel for the market, you've got no feel for the culture. I think that's a definite moment when you just go, oof, have we bitten off too much?
Yeah, I like that. Mac, what do you reckon?
For us, there's two sides to this. I think for us, it's actually maintaining momentum.
Yeah.
So I think we're in low 30s countries at the moment, and it's actually kind of unsatisfying because we've always been very global for what we want to serve for our users.
Yeah.
And so I think for us, it's how do you, I wouldn't say it's necessarily an oh moment, but it's how do you keep momentum?
Yes.
In terms of launching new markets once you get going, because that's the aspiration.
Yeah.
I think for our users, it tends to be actually not being afraid to kind of pivot a little bit. If I think of the Vinomofo guys have success in New Zealand, success in Singapore, but they've always been talking about the US, and you never know which sequence it's going to go in because you got to get back to regulations or understanding the market. And so I think the fact that there's going to be twists and turns is part of the journey.
Yeah.
I think you can't buy time, and so the more you want to expand, the more you do, the less you've got, in terms of time to yourself or to look at your business or to your team. And that's the thing you have to keep in mind is how to actually manage your time and how you manage that, expansion as well. Because I had weeks or months where I was sleeping 4 hours a night, and I'm driven by the passion for the business, and I'll do it for as long as it takes. But it's got an impact on the rest of the family, for instance, or even your team, because you're not there. When you're there, you're just a ghost. I spend 3 days a month in Australia, and it's never enough. And so it's keeping in mind that it's going to impact your people, yourself, your family, your sometimes customers. We've got a few mistakes. We've done a few mistakes along the way by making the wrong decisions because we were kind of opportunistic. And I'm sure that if we had, in hindsight, not pressed the pedal that hard, maybe we would have avoided a few of those mistakes. So
is that the trade-off you have to make, though? Between being too cautious and not taking the risk and not getting the uplift, and taking that risk and running the risk that it tanks?
You know what? If I had to do it again, I'll do it all the same. So I think I'm just giving you advice, but don't follow them necessarily. It's just you have to be aware of those things. They're going to happen if you're all in. It's going to suck you in.
Yeah. You got one, Joe?
CEOs can never get away from fundraising. It's always the delight of our lives. And there are often delays with that. You might get to where you're ready to sign, and then someone will pull this new condition out on you, and you've started to resource and plan ahead on that. So I think you've always got to have multiple funding cycles in your trajectory and keep a realistic on what's probable and what's not.
Mm. So just talking about all these known or unknown knowns, all these black swans that crop up to surprise us on this journey, what do you guys wish you'd known at the start? Sitting here with the benefit of hindsight, looking back, what's the one piece of information that would have been gold for you to have when you started out?
I'll start with that one. I think, I was quite pragmatic. I didn't have rose-coloured glasses on when I started the journey. So one of the things I did, and probably even underestimated that, was the impact that it is going to have on your life as you knew it. It will stretch you up, down, left, right and centre in every possible way. And you need to have a really good family support crew around you because they're going to get impacted. And they're the ones that are going to lift you up and hold you up when those tough times come. But if you've got issues with them coming on the journey with you, they are going to raise their head at the worst possible moment, and you're going to have to play that emotional trade-off of, your family and your aspirations, and that's something you need to be very mindful of.
Yeah, great tip.
I think for me, it's the time. Multiply by 3 to 5, whatever you think it's going to take. Because we, as entrepreneur, we're super optimistic. We think that it's a no-brainer. We've got an idea and it's just going to happen, and it takes time. Everything takes time, and it's just the nature of the game, I guess. So you have to learn how to be patient, and to be patient, to make sure that you got enough money in the bank to not end up at the end of that runway and fall off the cliff. So it's about understanding that things take time.
Yeah.
I think there's a coming back to people point for me on this one. So whether it's people we work with or our team, I'd almost say like always be recruiting is actually the thing I'd think about. It's real work to find the people that are going to carry the culture, and so like as you launch new markets, they're going to be the right people that make everything happen.
Yeah, I think as you scale up, and particularly when you go overseas, founders of businesses are kind of mythical creatures, right? They've got this like blast zone around them, and we definitely saw that we didn't get our internal communication that slick until quite recently. And if you were within the blast zone of like the founding party, it was awesome. And then as you ebbed further away, it wasn't as fun, and you found people weren't as engaged.
Yeah.
And we've kind of just flipped to where you kind of make that a little bit more, not systematic, sounds like a very cold way of calling culture. But you actually have to have a way to imbue, one thing that as you're growing that startups need a lot of people giving discretionary effort. Like startups don't grow because people clock in at 8 and go home at 5. Sylvain was talking about, one of the Whispli guys on demos at 10 o'clock at night. Like that's the reality of going global, right? Startups and going global. And founders need to figure out how the person working for them in London or in the States or in Southeast Asia, wherever it might be, feels that passion as well. And that for founders is taxing, because that's just pure personal time going back into the business, not on solving problems that they don't know they need to solve.
Yeah.
Just bouncing on Max's point around people, I think when you start a business, it's all kind of about you and your idea, and you know everything, and you know how to do demos and everything. So it's kind of hard to delegate to others in a way. But I can tell you that once you've got the right people on board, and I think that's when you know that you've got the right team and the right culture, it's just such a delight to know that you don't have to be around. Things are gonna work, and that's when you can actually take some altitude and think about other things. And we're getting at that stage with Whispli where, I'm here 3 days a month, and I'm not worrying a bit about what's going on into the office. I know that people are all behind the business, and they know what they're doing. So my view is I always hire kind of entrepreneur people that know and can teach us something, that can bring something to the business. The only thing I know is the idea and the vision of the company. They make everything else happen, and that's the joy after a while when you. So if you can get those people very early on, that's fantastic. But the sooner the better, because they will lift you up. So people are definitely coming first.
We are rapidly running out of time, and I have so many more questions that I want to ask the panel. I could probably keep them here for another couple of hours, but we've talked a lot about why, we've talked about how, we've talked about challenges. Can I kind of go to the other end of the spectrum and ask you, what's the transformation that going global has created for the company? What can you look at and kind of say, wow, that's been incredible for our company, for our clients, and maybe for you as a person?
So I can start. For me, it was it's the positioning and the go-to-market of Whispli. Going into the US, I was kind of facing a wall, and everybody was telling me the US is very different. You'll see it's you can't have either your Australian or French attitude when you get there. You need to kind of understand the market, and it's so true. It took me nearly a year to get that, but it's so refreshing when you know how to actually tackle such a big market, when you understand that the reason why they're not buying your product. And so for me, it was all about the learning on discovering that Whispli was, yes, a whistleblowing platform, but it's actually morphing into what we call enabling trusted conversations, which is a lot more than whistleblowing, which is super scary for anyone, because you'll probably never be a whistleblower. And if you're one day, I can tell you you're gonna be really, really scared. But if you talk about trusted conversation, it's a lot broader. It's about employee well-being and employee engagement and employee retention and all of that. And there's a lot of positive in there. And in the US, this is what that was the eye opener. We saw HR people coming to us and say, hey, we could use that to actually retain our people. And so it opened up an all new kind of opportunities for Whispli, which is 100 times bigger than what Whispli was a year ago. So that's it.
Yeah, I think we've spoken a lot about the challenges of going global, and often those challenges come back to go-to-market, operational, platform orientated, like actual like technical things you can wrap your head around. There from a personal level, there's an immense richness in going global, and that is that. Simon has got 750 staff around the world now, and circa 400 or 500 of them are not in Australia. And it's hugely rewarding for us as a business, and my own personal development has been aided by the fact that we're a very culturally diverse business, and I think our business is in a better place because we have that richness of diversity that if we got too deep in Australia, it would be quite hard to untangle. Because we went early, say you get ties, we've got people in the Philippines, we've got people in Europe, we've got people in the States, and they all add to the flavour of the business.
Yeah, fantastic.
I'll just go quickly. I've been in tech my whole life, so this was a calling for me on a human level, that I felt that we were losing freedoms, and I had to do something. I had to put everything on the line to tackle this problem. When I started, everybody said the privacy was dead. In the last 6 months, we've had the CEO of Apple, Microsoft, Facebook saying privacy is the future. So it's very nice when you're so compelled to drive global change. When you're told at the beginning that you can't do it, now you see the best in the world saying it has to happen. So that's nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd just reinforce the personal type one where we have conversations with users about a new product, and we think we're going to do this, and we think we're going to do these markets, and when literally you go 6 months later and you're having a conversation about it's doing this and here's the plan, and it's like amazing to sort of see the transformation in sort of people's minds. So there's plenty of positives as well.
Awesome. Thanks to the panel for all your insight and expertise.